Hello and welcome to The Entrepreneurs on Monocle Radio, the show all about inspiring people, innovative companies and fresh ideas in global business. Today's programme is all about a passion for flying. We meet a founder of an aviation company that delivers exceptional aircraft solutions and contributes to the development of infrastructure to support the future of sustainable flight.
There's so much funding, there's so much investment going into new technology. How are we going to be able to support that industry? And that's our job. That's the challenge for me now, being innovative and entrepreneurial, is to try to find those opportunities.
This is The Entrepreneurs, with me, Tom Edwards. You're listening to The Entrepreneurs. Edwin Brenninkmeyer is the founder and CEO of Oriens Aviation, a company that aims to make aircraft ownership a breeze, providing high-quality solutions and services, including aircraft sales, charter management, and plane maintenance. Edwin stopped by Midori House to discuss the company's journey to becoming a leader in the industry, their impressive fleet, and his passion for sustainable aviation. Edwin began by telling me about his early fascination with flight.
My mother tells me that I was 3 years old and I just always wanted to fly. I just always had this desire. I mean, we live in a two-dimensional world. We live in a three-dimensional world, but we only move in 2 dimensions. So for me, it was that obvious. I just had to fly and, see things from the 3rd dimension. So I've always been fascinated by flight, and I was one of those very geeky kids, I'm afraid, who build model airplanes and love model airplanes. And then I think my first flight was when I was 12 years old, and that was in Switzerland. So you can imagine, just stunning backdrop there, the Alps and the beautiful Swiss summer weather. And the first flight didn't work out because of the weather, but that was an opportunity for me to speak to the pilot, and he soon learned just what an aviation geek I was. So the second flight, when I actually did get to fly, he let me have a go on the controls and let me fly, and I was just completely hooked. Well, I didn't need convincing, but I think that was it. And I was very fortunate that my parents supported me through my flying. So I started learning to fly when I was 14, and I was allowed 1 flying lesson every holiday. And then I finally got my private license when I was 17.
Okay, so 3 sparking the interest, 12 taking the controls, 14. We're talking still even in an industry though there's quite a few precocious talents. That's if not prodigious, it's going early, which I like. And then tell me then, as then ripple dissolve and you are going through your education and stuff like this. This was always the guiding light. I know you studied, even when you were studying business, business aviation. Did you have a clarity about what this pathway would look like, or did you just know what it was going to involve and you dealt with the specifics as you found them?
No, I didn't really have any clarity in those days. I mean, I knew obviously that I was very, very passionate about flying, clearly, but I come from a very large family business. So I spent my early career in the family business in retail. I really learned a huge amount about business from that. So I learned about leadership, about managing a team. I was expanding stores in the Czech Republic and based in Austria as well. So my early career was very much business, but somehow I was always drawn to entrepreneurship. And I think it was the entrepreneurship. I obviously always flew, so I was flying privately, and that was going on in the background. But when I was a buyer, in the retail business, I loved those, suppliers that we spoke to. A lot of them were entrepreneurs, and they started their own business and started manufacturing clothes or distributing clothes. And I just loved that. I just thought that whole idea of setting up your own business and doing something entrepreneurial was fascinating. So I think those 2 things ran in parallel. I mean, I was flying, working in retail, learning about business, but drawn to entrepreneurship.
Okay, so I guess subconsciously even maybe you were laying these twin foundations for what you've gone on to do. Tell me about that then. You understood your own entrepreneurialism, I guess, from what you say, which is interesting because sometimes people almost don't seem to realise that they're doing it. The kid with the lemonade stand or whatever. How did you get started then with Oriens? I know we're jumping a lot further forward.
Yeah, that's quite a long step. I mean, I think the first thing to say is that I worked in venture capital, so part of our family business we had VC as well. And there's a big opportunity in the mid-2000s. A lot of very savvy tech entrepreneurs were experimenting with, they were saying essentially there's a confluence of 3 technologies, the power plant, the avionics and the aeroplane, and also the manufacturing technology. And when those 3 things come together, you could produce a very, very cost-effective jet. And I thought, cool, because I love flying. And I thought, well, there's a way you can democratize aviation and make it more accessible to people and bring the cost down of private aviation. That's got to be a win. And I mean, Sam Walton, so I was in retail. Sam Walton was the founder of Walmart. He was a pilot, and he actually looked for sites for his clothing chains or for his stores from an aeroplane. So he had an aircraft, and that's how he started. So the venture capital, that whole new segment of the market, We invested in a company in the US. That taught me a lot about entrepreneurship, learning about, what you're looking for as a venture capitalist. What are the key drivers, the importance of a team, the importance of having skin in the game as a leader, as an entrepreneur, being vested in your business, the importance of getting proof of concept first, doing it step by step. So all of those things were invaluable. And then I also did an MBA, so I focused on entrepreneurship and also aviation within my MBA. There wasn't really enough deal flow. So a lot of those companies that we looked at, they were in the US, and that's where the industry was starting. But a lot of the European companies, we just found that the deal flow was somewhat lacking. A lot of the business plans were written by pilots who are very well trained as pilots, passionate about the technology, but we were struggling to find investable business plans. And that's where I shifted because I really wanted to stay in entrepreneurship. And that's where I moved into consulting. So I was actually advising a lot of these companies as to how they could actually pitch for funding, how they could write a business plan based on that previous experience. And that's what led me to the Oriens Aviation experience. That was just my view of the market and seeing what was going on. That's how that started.
So it kind of is one of these entrepreneurial stories where the deeper you got, the more you understood it, the more people were seeking your expertise, the more you could identify that there was essentially a gap that you knew how to fill. Is that a fair characterization?
I think that's a fair characterization. I think what I learned really by consulting and also by being in venture capital is I got to explore all different elements of the value chain in aviation. So I got to see where the opportunity in aviation is, and frankly, how you can make money in aviation, where the success is. And I was also able to, as you said, quite rightly, spot a gap in the market and identify opportunities. My philosophy has always been, I love being entrepreneurial and creating something different. But if you can start from a sort of more secure and solid foundation, that just gives you a good platform from which you can be more entrepreneurial and grow, and that de-risks it somewhat. Mm-hmm. So for me, the starting with Pilatus, so a big Swiss manufacturer of business aviation aircraft, was a fantastic way. Yes, it was a risk because we do purchase aircraft from the manufacturer, so we're not just an agent. We buy the airplanes, we take all the risk. But also a fantastic opportunity. They, as an OEM, were really going places, and I could see that the market was growing in the UK. There's an opportunity to develop that brand in the UK and to just increase awareness of that product. So for me, that was building that safe haven. I learned a lot from the American businesses and how they actually structured their business. That's the safe haven. And from that safe haven, I could then start to be more entrepreneurial, or that was the plan.
Well, that's interesting because when we talk about business aviation in Monocle, often there is this difference. It's kind of like the USA and then everyone else. Mm-hmm. But it's instructive to me that you felt you could take your understanding of that market and apply it or overlay it or be informed by it when looking at the European space.
You mean the US market?
Yeah, because the dynamics are so different. And yet they're clearly, given your successes, are things you have very clearly identified. Are they also how not to do as well as how to do things, do you think?
I think that the whole infrastructure in the US is very different from Europe. So airports are public, for example. So the same as roads are public in this country, and American airports are public. So it's very, very different in Europe. And airports in most places in Europe, with the exception of France, but most places in Europe, airports are private. So they have to make money and they're a commercial business in their own right. So the model of airports is very different. And I think as a result of that, the cost base in Europe tends to be higher than it is in the US. And then I think from the customer's point of view, there is definitely a difference. So 70% or 80% of business aviation customers in the US, people who travel on business jets, are actually middle management. And that's surprising. People don't realize that. They always think of a business jet. They think it's the rich and the famous traveling around. That's absolutely not the case. And the US are so advanced in that. I think it's because it's the difficulty to travel to these smaller locations. The US air transportation network is very hub and spoke. So, they have large hubs where all the airliners connect through. So if you want to travel from secondary location to secondary location, you're either driving or you're taking the airline through a hub. And it's just quite onerous to travel. And I think that's why the US business aviation has just exploded. And I think in Europe, there's a slight cultural difference as well. I think the consumer in Europe, there's this perception that, that business aviation is seen as excessive and glamorous, and it's not seen as a business tool in quite the same way. And I think that's really what I'm passionate about changing, is that perception, because it is a business tool. And I've experienced that myself in business, with my own flying. I can get to all these places, without having to go through the major hubs. And when I had stores, in the retail business, I was going to all these small locations without having to go to the major international airports. So it is a productivity tool. And I also used to fly, myself as a business aviation pilot, and we used to do multi-leg trips in one day, drop a passenger off, then fly somewhere else, and then get them all back home at night. And that's the thing, they could actually see their families. And without business aviation, they wouldn't have been able to do that. They'd have had to stay somewhere, stay overnight in a hotel, or maybe even 2 nights in a hotel, whereas you could do all that in one day. So there is a difference between the US and Europe, and I think it's it'd be nice to try to educate the European market that it really is a productivity tool. but it's hard to measure. And that's the difficulty because, of course, business aviation depends how you use it, but generally, yes, it is more costly than the airline or the car. But of course, you're saving so much time, and it's how much value you place on your time and getting back to your family, getting home at night. It's those intangibles that you also have to factor in, and that's tricky to do.
Oh, yeah, and I think we're getting more enlightened about the value of that time as this sort of premium metric to look at, not just in a business context, but generally. Talk to me a little bit about some of the superstars. So Pilatus is a brand that we've covered at Monocle, obviously, with our fascination with aviation and Swissness and so forth. I don't know, give me an example. PC-12, take me inside one of these aircraft. Tell me why it works so well, why you love it, why you want to be the guy that's selling these aircraft on and so forth here in this country. What's the USP maybe, and give us some of your personal feelings about it.
Yeah, so maybe just a little bit of history. So the Pilatus really built very tough utilitarian aircraft, and they also built military aircraft as well. And the story of the PC-12 really goes back to the Royal Flying Doctor Service in Australia. They needed a product that was fit for the outback, landing in those sort of in the bush, basically. So they needed a very rugged aeroplane that was large enough, had a big cargo door that they could get their patients in very, very easily without the wing getting in the way or bits of aircraft structure and all that sort of thing. And that's what Pilatus built. And they built the PC-12 really for the Royal Flying Doctor Service. And then somebody looked at it and said, this could be a really cool executive transport. Put some leather seats in it, make it look a little bit more luxurious. And the rest is history. I think it's the fact that aircraft is so versatile. It really can do everything. And that's the amazing thing about it. There's always a compromise in aviation. It might not be the fastest aircraft. A jet is obviously faster. But door to door, so if you're trying to get from one destination to the other, your travel time could be significantly reduced simply because you can access airfields that are much closer to your final destination or your point of departure than you would be able to in a jet. And it's a large cabin, and that's the beauty of it. And it's very, very fuel efficient. So again, going back to the environmental argument, it's incredibly fuel efficient and relatively very, very green aircraft. And that's really the beauty. And I think, again, as you said, the Swissness of it, the Swiss quality, they take enormous pride in very, very high standards of manufacturing, and you can see that throughout the aeroplane. I could bore you to tears with all the different parts of the aeroplane.
You're in good company here. You're in good company here, Edwin. Surely, you know kind of tireless proclivities here. Tell me about the conversations you have then with clients in terms of the aircraft they want you to tell them about, show them, sell them, maybe. What's on their agenda? As you said, it's an industry that is always driving innovation, but things take time, and obviously to roll out new models, whether you're a smaller player or a huge airframer, you can't throw a switch and do these things overnight. So how do you sort of manage getting people excited about newness, but ensuring that people are with you for the journey? What kind of narratives do people bring to you in terms of what they want you to tell them?
I think, the customers really vary a lot. So I think I'm trying to unpack that question. So I think the first thing is, if you're speaking to the customer, it's really what does the customer want? And every customer has a different requirement and a different need. So that's the first thing. And it could well be that our products aren't suitable for the customer and they're actually better off with another product. And we will tell them that. I think it's so important to build that trust and that relationship with the customer, first of all. In terms of the innovation and the newness that you asked, aviation is very conservative. And I think that's what a lot of entrepreneurs, technology entrepreneurs in aviation have learnt to their cost in the past, that that they very, very smart entrepreneurs in other fields, and they come up with a fantastic idea, a very innovative idea, but then they struggle to get it certified, and that's the challenge. It's a very, very conservative industry. So going back to the Pilatus, Pilatus has been around since 1939. They've been building aeroplanes for a very, very long time. So once they built their aircraft for the Royal Flying Doctor Service, they already had that track record. The PC-12 has been around since 1994, so it's not dramatically new. But they constantly innovate and they constantly update it and constantly evolve it. So the fundamental concept is the same in its sound, and yet they're constantly evolving. So to come back to your question about innovation, I think the answer there really is starting at the very light end. So if you start at the sub 600 kilo, and that's what the CA in the UK have realised, that's where the innovation can take place. That there's a smaller market. It's much easier to certify and produce a light aircraft, which is simpler. You don't have complex systems. Doesn't make it mean it's any less safe. It's just as safe, but it's very simple, very cost effective, and that's where you can start to innovate. And if you can get the proof of concept at that very small light sector of the market, you can then expand that and grow it into the heavier sector. And then you've got a track record as well, because you've already got that proof of concept. So
no, it's complicated. And I just wondered, are there ever times then when you think back to your sort of NCAP days, or when you were able to, I guess, move and look from business to business and find those opportunities maybe at a pace that's a little bit different when you've got the skin in the game. Is it ever frustrating? Or,
No, I don't
or
think
actually,
so.
do you like that deeper kind of investment of time and energy and all the rest of it?
Yeah, no, I think there's huge opportunity for innovation now. As I said before, I think I've already mentioned, I think you need to get that foundation first, and we've got that foundation now with our business. So the next stage now is what, and I'm very interested in the infrastructure. So if you're developing electric aviation, hydrogen powered aircraft that are more greener and more environmentally friendly, what infrastructure are those aircraft going to need? We have a maintenance company, for example. So we're maintaining traditional aircraft, but there's so much funding, there's so much investment going into new technology. How are we going to be able to support that industry? And that's our job. That's the challenge for me now, being innovative and entrepreneurial, is to try to find those opportunities. And so we're actually also working with an Italian manufacturer, for example, and they're doing exactly that. They're building electric aircraft, or they were looking at electric aircraft, and they're still very innovative and looking at the way forward. And for us, that de-risks what they're doing, because they have traditionally powered aircraft, but that doesn't stop them from being innovative. Again, they have that base and they have that foundation of the traditional aircraft, but they're also being very innovative and looking at electric aircraft. And that's without risking our business, because I think there are about 480 startups in electric aviation. So it's very risky to know which one to go with. So that de-risks our business. We're working with an established manufacturer with established power plants, and we're learning and observing what's happening in the industry, where's it going, and how can we actually invest in infrastructure. We haven't got there yet, but that's the challenge. So to answer your question, that's very much the next step for us.
A big journey.
Foundation.
Well, tell me, how do you ensure that all the different stakeholders kind of get on board? Because you said there is the buy-in, literal and metaphoric, from all these different players, regulators, governments, etc. But there are a lot of different people, and they've got different interests, and the time frames are different. We know how difficult as entrepreneurs it is to get over the short-termism in certain sectors, if you look politically and this kind of thing. Are you confident that the interests are, I don't know, they overlay each other sufficiently that we will get where we need to go? If you look at, say, building infrastructure, I mean, that is a enormous and complex challenge. Are you confident you have enough conversations with people who are invested in this space to really believe that we'll get where we need to go?
I think so, yeah. I think the biggest threat that I see at the moment is that it's going to take a long time, and it's going to take longer than people realise. I think especially from the regulatory point of view. And that's my concern, is that people are going to get frustrated that it's taking too long and lose interest. But I don't think that'll happen, because I think there's so much funding, there's so much innovation, there's so much drive to move this forward. And, as I said, when I was in venture capital back in the sort of the mid to late 2000s, that wasn't there. I mean, there was funding there, but it was a very different drive. I mean, there was no external drive from outside the industry to push this innovation with the industry. And now there is. And there's a lot of funding available as well. So I'm very confident. But I think that the risk that I see is that investors will get somewhat turned off, because aviation traditionally is perceived as a high-risk industry. And it is. There are a lot of startup manufacturers, and most of them will fail. I mean, that's the reality. But there will be some tremendous successes. And I think that the danger that I see is that investors will get burnt. They'll invest in a product that doesn't work, that fails. It'll be very high profile. Everyone will see this product hasn't worked, and they'll get despondent and lose interest in the industry. And that's the danger. And that's what I'd like to encourage people to, it will require a lot of investment. And I think in history, that's always been the case. Every time there's been a new innovation, people have got burnt and investors have got burnt. But, eventually the good technologies come through and they're very successful.
Yeah. Let's talk a bit more about Oriens. I know you've got holdings in all sorts of non-aviation interests as well as aviation. Give me a little bit of a sense. You're looking at the rest of 24. I don't know, how do you allocate your time amongst the different things you're doing? What are you most excited about? What are the priorities? Obviously, you can't give us all your key strategic objectives, but give me a sense of how, if you look at the second half, what's going to be on your plate as you tackle that?
So I think really we've had a fair bit of growth recently. So, we've added new businesses to Oriens Aviation. I think that the key thing for me now is to make sure that we have the right culture. That's absolutely critical. We've got to have the right safety culture. And I think we're all doing it. I mean, the great thing is that, I've been very fortunate to have had the right people to come on board Oriens. So we have a very, very strong and very good team, and they completely share my values and my ethos, which I think is very, very important. But I think the key now is to do that more intentionally, because as we grow the company, again, I keep coming back to this foundation. We need to have the right foundation, not only the products and the services of what we provide, but also the staff and the expertise, and the right ethos has to be there. I pride myself on long-term business and long-term value creation. I'm not looking for an exit in 2 or 3 years. So I'm really trying to build and create long-term value. I'm not saying, by the way, that if you do exit in 2 or 3 years, that's necessarily a bad thing. You can still create long-term value if you exit, but I just think it's having that long-term perspective that ultimately benefits the customers, because aviation is not such a short-term thing. Somebody buys an aeroplane and they tend to remain a customer for a number of years, and we need to support them. And then, of course, there's an upgrade path. They start maybe with a small aircraft and then they go to a slightly larger one and then they go to a jet, so there's always that upgrade path. Or they even start in charter. That's how we actually acquire our customers, through our charter business initially. The priority for me is really getting that foundation stable, and then it's being entrepreneurial again. I think for me, it's very much about looking for the next opportunity. Once we've got that stable foundation with what we have now and what we've acquired, it's then being entrepreneurial and working with OEMs that are being entrepreneurial, and we already are. As I mentioned, the Italian manufacturer, for example, Pilatus are always looking at new innovations as well, but more cautiously. I mean, they've got a very, again, aviation is a conservative industry, so the real innovation happens at the lighter end than Pilatus, and then the rest of the industry follows. And that's what I'm looking at. So I'm now investing in an electric aviation startup for that precise reason. I think it's a very good concept. It's simple. There's no massive complexity, and the simplicity of it means it's easier to get certification, proof of concept, get to market, customer confidence, all of those things. Starting at the light end, and with that proof of concept, again, that can scale. And that's where I'm trying to understand that industry better. And hopefully the first flight will be this year, so that'll be very exciting. But that's outside Oriens, so
yeah, that is exciting. Well, and then, as you say, if you factor in those other considerations, maybe it goes from being at what you said, 1 in 500 shot to maybe 1 in 50 shot, or whatever it might be. Where do you get your sort of business inspiration? Obviously, you've done the MBA path and all the rest of it, and you have so much hands-on experience. But do you like reading? Would I find you reading sort of Lee Iacocca autobiography, this kind of thing, or where do you get that inspiration when you're looking at those next stages? Do you just like to case study actual businesses that are doing things now and try and get under the hood there?
Yeah, I think so. Historically, I'd say I've been very fortunate to come from a large family business. So I'm one of the youngest of the 5th generation. 6th generation have already started. So again, I talked about long-term value creation. I guess that's where it comes from. So I think that was my sort of initial inspiration, really, is my own family business, which I think has been very successful. And I think now I'm really studying a lot about ethical business and how to do business ethically. So I'm reading a lot of, for example, Charles Koch. I don't know if you know the Koch industries in the US. He's written a book called Good Profit on how to, so those are the kind of books I'm reading. Another great book, by the way, which I can recommend, is Unreasonable Hospitality by Will Guidera. And I think that absolutely applies in our industry. I don't know if you've come across it, but he was in the restaurant business. And he realized that, he wasn't in the business of food. He was actually in the business of connecting people. So it's that being very, very attentive, and not only to the customer, but to each other. That's the key thing as well. It's being very attentive within the organization to each other, to your employees. And if you have that good culture within your business, then that translates to your customers as well. And I think that's how you can excel. And your customers will, again, it's not about being the best, it's about being the customer's favorite. And you can't take that away from them. If the customer says, "You're my favorite company," that's a personal statement, right? And I just love that. That's something that you can't argue with. If you say I'm the best, you can pick holes in it, you can argue it, and you can say, well, what about this and what about that? But no, you're my favorite. And that's so those are the books that are inspiring me at the moment. So I'm trying to, I think, again, that's currently the phase where I'm at, is trying to make sure that we're more intentional, that we get that culture right. And that's what I'm focusing on right now.
I like that. We were talking about unreasonable hospitality with Scott Malkin from Value Retail just recently on this programme. So great minds think alike and all that jazz, Edwin. Just tell me about external inspiration for you. Presumably, as a flyer, is that the moment of detachment from busy in-tray and difficult questions and responsibilities when you're kind of literally above the clouds? Or where do you find those, what I imagine are only fleeting moments of peace and quiet for you, Edwin?
Yeah, look, I'm, again, very, very fortunate. So I do a lot of flying. I fly ex-military jets as well, which is wonderful. And that's something completely different. So I wouldn't say it's a moment of detachment, because you have to be very focused and very on your A game when you're flying an ex-military jet. It's very procedural, and I think if you're a pilot and flying those kind of machines, you have to take pride in doing things to the very highest standards. But yes, you're right. It's not detachment, because you're still very focused, but it's a completely different environment. And I think that's the wonderful thing about it. You're out of your office. You're completely focused on the task at hand. So you're not thinking about work. You're not thinking about those things. And it is, yes, even though it's quite demanding, you have to focus a lot of your attention to it. It takes your mind off work. I think that's a very, very healthy balance to have. And it keeps you sharp. I'm not the sort of person that can just sit around, to be honest.
I wondered, I was suspecting that would not be the case. And do you get, I don't know, is it, as you sort of walk away from one of these aircraft, does the solution to the problem that had been vexing you suddenly, is it that easy, or is it more, it's just more about the value that adds in terms
I think it's the value that it adds. I think it's just the detachment, as you say. So just something completely different. So It clears the mind. And then I'd say afterwards, yes, because the mind's clearer. So afterwards, you're thinking much more clearly and the ideas come to you. I wouldn't say while I'm flying. That's not the case.
He's very focused, ladies and gentlemen.
Exactly.
Now, listen, I'd get in trouble from Tyler if I didn't ask you this question, because I've had the privilege at Monocle talking to lots of pilots, commercial pilots, private pilots, and I generally try to ask them, what's your favourite arrival into an airport? And one of my favourite tales was an Aussie pilot who was flying, I think, for Cathay for a number of years, and he used to fly into the old Hong Kong airport through kind of looking through people's windows, coming into Kai Tak, that kind of thing. Yeah. I don't know if it's your fantasy arrival anywhere. Maybe it could even be an airport from days gone by, or on your current roster. What's the kind of Edwin's number one pick?
I've got to say, I love the mountains. Samadan in Switzerland does it for me every time. It's a stunning approach, absolutely stunning. I mean, flying through the mountains and even going to the factories. So Pilatus themselves, they're in the middle of Switzerland. And it is the most beautiful approach. I mean, coming through the mountains and through the valleys, it's absolutely breathtaking. It really is. Doesn't get any better than that. So hands down.
Do we sometimes get that moment where you're like, no, it's fine. I'll come out and see you? Does that? It's like the additional meeting that possibly you didn't quite need to schedule, but you just schedule anyway.
It's just fun. I mean, taking the customers to the factory. Yeah, I mean, I'm always finding an excuse to go to the factory with the customer. It's just so much fun to do. I mean, the customer loves the experience. It's the flying. It's seeing the mountains. It's just being in Switzerland by the lake, seeing how they build the airplanes. Seeing the factories. Just the whole thing is just amazing.
Edwin, before we started recording, I said, I'm going to ask you about Biggin Hill. Mm-hmm. Now, for listeners in the UK probably know about it. In fact, and our educated listeners around the globe will probably be familiar with sort of World War II stories. But is that where you're kind of based, or where part of the business is run out of?
It is, yes. We're based in Biggin Hill, correct. Yeah.
Why so? Just indulge me for a moment with my interest in World War II history and the Battle of Britain and all the rest of it. Is that part of it? Obviously, it's a really interesting little hub, just kind of in but outside London. Give me the whys and wherefores.
Yeah, I mean, look, I've got to be honest. The real reason we're in Biggin Hill is a little bit more boring, but yeah, I mean, it's we have to be in a London airport. That's very important. So Biggin Hill is actually also very close to Europe. So flying outside the UK to Europe from an airspace point of view is very, very straightforward. The other London airports are. I mean, Oxford is another great possibility because it's quite close, to the centre of the country as well. But generally, the other London airports are either too small, so they're private airports that don't have customs, that don't have all the instrument landing facilities, or they're too big. They're airline airports that are trying to squeeze out business aviation, or they're too costly because they're slot restricted. So, that's why Biggin Hill for us really was the optimal airport. But I mean, it is absolutely historic. I mean, if you're working at Biggin Hill, I mean, during the summer, you hear the Spitfire, the Merlin engines, 8 times a day, every day. I mean, it's incredible. So they actually do flights for the public in Spitfires based out of Biggin Hill, and that, of course, harks back to to the Battle of Britain and the wartime history that Biggin Hill has. So it's wonderful to be based there, and certainly when I was a child, and still now, I've always been fascinated by the Battle of Britain, and that's always inspired me. People like Douglas Bader, who just their determination and perseverance, despite all the odds, they just continued and carried on flying. It's a tremendous entrepreneurial story. And that's really where, my passion for aviation, I wouldn't say started, but really was kindled and catalysed and grew. And I'm at Biggin Hill now. So, yeah, come full circle, as it were.
I love it. And the 3-year-old, maybe not the 3-year-old Edwin, but what about that precocious 12-year-old, taking the controls for the first time? Do you think he would kind of believe it today if he was able to glance ahead at what you're doing?
That's a great question. I think Kermit Weeks, who runs Fantasy of Flight in Florida, he's an amazing, very inspiring guy as well. And I think he famously said, when he started, if he would have known when he started how big his business was, he would have been put off. He would have been so he just said he would never have got into it. But yeah, it's just wonderful to be able to, pursue what you're passionate about. I think that's the key. I think that's the key to entrepreneurship. You need to have, clearly there has to be a market, but if you can find the right market, find the right customer, and match that with your passion, that's just the best place to be, without question.
That was Edwin Brenninkmeyer, the founder and CEO of Oriens Aviation. And you can learn more about the brand by heading to oriensaviation.com. And that's all for this episode of The Entrepreneurs. We'll be back at the same time next week. Do look out for Eureka, available every Friday. The programme was produced by Laura Kramer, with audio editing by Tamsin Howard. You can listen again and find out more about the show at monocle.com, or follow us and catch up with the archive via your preferred podcast platform. If you'd like to get in touch with the team, email Laura. She's on lrk@monocle.com. I'm Tom Edwards. Goodbye, and thanks for listening to The Entrepreneurs.